I never thought a trash can could start a war. But when you live under the gaze of an HOA run by people with too much time on their hands and too little common sense, the smallest thing becomes a battlefield. And in my case, that battlefield was the stretch of pavement in front of my house where I placed my heavy-duty green bin every Wednesday morning for pickup. A simple and routine act I'd been doing since moving into the neighborhood, but one that would soon become the center of a petty crusade led by none other than Karen, the woman who strutted through the cul-de-sac as though she personally owned every blade of grass, every car tire mark on the street, and every scrap of siding on the homes around her, a woman who, from the moment I moved in, seemed to have cataloged me as her enemy, though at first it was just small things. A passive-aggressive smile, a thinly veiled insult about my lawn not being quite in step with the HOA's standards, or a comment about my garage door color not blending with the rest of the street, but soon those subtle digs escalated into actual sabotage. And the first real line in the sand was drawn over my trash can, the same one I dragged to the curb every week at dawn, only to return home from work and find it mysteriously tipped over, its contents spilling onto my driveway. The kind of mess that neighbors would drive by slowly just to shake their heads at, as if I were the neighborhood slob, when in truth I knew exactly who was behind it, because no one else in the world had such a vendetta against the sight of a trash bin than Karen, the self-appointed guardian of our HOA's image. And I caught her red-handed one Thursday morning when I pretended to leave for work, but circled back around the block quietly in my truck, parking far enough away that she wouldn't hear the engine. And there she was, in her robe of all things, creeping across the sidewalk, looking around like a burglar, before she nudged her foot against the bottom of my can and pushed until it toppled, laughing to herself as if she'd accomplished something noble, as if knocking over a container of my coffee grounds and old pizza boxes somehow elevated her above me. And in that moment I felt my blood boil, because it wasn't just about the can, it was about the principle, about her need to assert power, to make me look bad while she wore the mask of a concerned neighbor. The same mask she no doubt wore at HOA board meetings when she complained about people like me labeling us as non-compliant or lazy or disruptive, but watching her do it with my own eyes changed everything. Because now I wasn't just suspicious, I was certain. And with certainty came a kind of freedom. The freedom to respond, to plan, to turn the game back on her in a way she'd never see coming. But before I could set my fix into motion, I had to endure weeks of her antics, each one more deliberate than the last. And every time I righted my can, I made mental notes, timing her walks, watching from the blinds, documenting the moments when she lingered too long near my property. And soon I had a file thick enough to make even the HOA president raise an eyebrow, though of course I didn't take it to him, not yet, because I knew the HOA wouldn't do a thing. Karen was their star, their model homeowner, the one who showed up early to every meeting and baked cookies for the block parties while simultaneously filing complaints behind the scenes. And the hypocrisy of it gnawed at me, fueled me, until one morning when I bent down to lift the can yet again, my hands sticky from soda cans that had burst open across the pavement, and I thought, no more. Not one more time, because if I let her keep doing this, she'd never stop. She'd keep escalating, and pretty soon it wouldn't just be my trash. It would be my mailbox, my car, maybe even my home. And I wasn't about to sit idle while she chipped away at my peace of mind. So that night I sat at my desk with a notebook, sketching out ideas like a general planning for war. Ideas ranging from the petty, like gluing the lid shut or installing a fake snake inside, to the strategic, like setting up a motion-activated sprinkler or a camera disguised in a birdhouse. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want just a prank or a piece of evidence. I wanted something that would flip the balance of power. Completely, something that would make her think twice every time she even glanced at my property. something she wouldn't recover from in the eyes of the neighborhood, and that's when the plan began to take shape, a plan so simple and yet so effective that I actually smiled to myself just imagining her reaction, but of course, before I could bring it to life, I had to gather supplies, test my setup, and above all, keep my cool around her, because Karen had a sixth sense for weakness, and if she caught even a whiff of what I was plotting, she'd double down. So I played it calm, polite even, waving to her across the street while inside I was coiling like a spring, readying the moment when she'd finally walk into a trap of her own making. But fate has a funny way of stirring the pot, because just when I thought I could execute my plan in secret, she pushed me further than ever before. And that was the day I came home, early from work, to find not just my trash can tipped, but the contents smeared across my car windshield, streaks of rotten food dripping down the glass, flies buzzing already, and standing there with her little dog on a leash was Karen, smiling like she'd just won the lottery, and she said, "Oh, dear, looks like the wind must have been strong today," before walking off as if I hadn't just caught her basking in the aftermath of her handiwork. And in that moment, something in me snapped. Not in anger, but in resolve, because that was the very last time she'd ever get the satisfaction of knocking over my can or smearing my reputation. And that night, under the glow of my garage light, I put the finishing touches on my fix, a fix that would not only stop her dead in her tracks, but leave her speechless, humiliated, and exposed for the entire neighborhood to see. Though, of course, the beauty of it was that she'd have no one to blame but herself. When I woke up the next morning, the smell of spoiled food still lingering in my garage after cleaning the mess Karen had orchestrated, I knew I couldn't delay any longer, because every time I saw her smug grin as she strutted past my driveway with that yapping little dog tugging at her leash, every time I thought about her mocking tone when she dismissed the evidence of her sabotage as the wind, my resolve hardened, and so I committed myself fully to building what I had only sketched the night before. My fix, my trump card, my masterpiece of petty yet devastating retaliation, though unlike Karen's mindless sabotage, mine had to be precise, calculated, and above all, impossible for her to pin on me, because if I've learned anything about dealing with people like her, it's that they thrive on playing the victim once they're caught, twisting the narrative until you're the villain. But this time, I wouldn't give her the satisfaction, and so I drove to the hardware store that Saturday, the kind of errand she'd think nothing of if she saw me leaving, and I wandered the aisles with a plan forming in my mind, scanning through motion sensors, security cameras, locking casters, and even industrial adhesives, until I pieced together exactly what I needed: a reinforced, weighted trash can outfitted with a concealed motion-triggered device that could both record her antics and respond in a way she could never anticipate. And I felt a thrill like a kid building a science fair project, except this project had the power to shatter the smug empire she'd built on gossip and HOA favoritism. So I loaded my cart with supplies, a set of steel brackets, a heavy-duty pad for anchoring, a discreet Wi-Fi-enabled camera small enough to hide beneath the lip of the bin, and the pièce de résistance, a motion-triggered compressed air horn designed to blast anyone who came within 2 feet of the can, the kind of shock that would send Karen flying back in horror when she tried her usual nudge and topple trick. And as I hauled everything into my truck, I imagined her face, her hair blown back, her eyes wide, the little dog barking in terror. And for the first time since this petty war began, I laughed, a genuine laugh, because I finally felt like I had control again, like I was no longer the one being toyed with, but the one quietly setting the stage for the downfall of my enemy. And that night I worked in the garage until well past midnight, assembling my contraption with meticulous care, securing the base so the bin couldn't be tipped, wiring the camera to my Wi-Fi so it streamed directly to my phone, testing the air horn with a broomstick until it blasted so loud it made me jump, despite knowing it was coming. And when I finally stepped back to admire my work, the heavy reinforced can gleaming under the overhead light, I felt a strange mix of pride and anticipation because this wasn't just about catching Karen in the act. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about turning her obsession into her undoing, and as I wheeled it into place the next morning, setting it neatly by the curb, I could hardly contain myself, because I knew she wouldn't be able to resist. She'd see it there like she always did, an eyesore in her perfect little world, and she'd wait until the coast was clear, just like the rat she was, creeping across the street in her robe, only this time, when her hand reached out or her foot nudged the plastic, the can would fight back, and I'd be watching from my phone. As the moment unfolded, recording every second in high definition, the blast startling her so badly she'd jump out of her skin, the footage capturing her red-handed in front of the very evidence she'd spent weeks trying to deny, and I could already imagine the neighborhood group chat, the whispers at the next board meeting, the fall from grace she'd experience when everyone saw the truth of who Karen really was. But as I sat in my truck across the street that morning, coffee in hand, watching through the windshield while the live feed streamed to my phone, I realized something else. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice, because for too long she'd operated unchecked, preying on neighbors too polite or too afraid to stand up to her, filing complaints, knocking things over, making lives miserable, and now she was about to be exposed, not by angry words or accusations, but by her own actions broadcast back at her, and sure enough, as the sun climbed higher and the street began to stir with the usual weekend sounds, I saw her door crack open, her little dog darting out ahead of her, and there she was, scanning the street with that hawk-like gaze, pretending to walk casually but with a clear destination in mind, her eyes locking onto my can like a predator stalking prey, and my heart raced with a mix of adrenaline and glee, because this was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment my fix would finally put an end to her reign of petty terror. And as she approached, glancing left and right, her hand reached out just as it always had, but this time the can was ready, and I leaned forward in my seat, watching, waiting, savoring the instant before her world turned upside down. There are few moments in life when time seems to slow down, when every heartbeat feels like a drum pounding in your ears, when your eyes refuse to blink because you don't want to miss a fraction of what's about to happen. And that morning, as Karen's manicured fingers reached toward the lip of my trash can, I felt that rare electricity, a shiver of anticipation running through me, because I knew I was about to witness justice in its purest form, justice not handed down by a court or an HOA committee, but by the very object she had tormented for weeks. And as her hand made contact with the can, pressing against it with that same smug little shove she always gave, the hidden motion sensor tripped, the air horn detonated with a sound like a freight train slamming through a tunnel, and the effect on Karen was instantaneous and glorious. She shrieked, stumbling, backward, her little dog yelping and tangling its leash around her legs as she flailed, her coffee cup launching into the air and splattering brown liquid all over her white robe, and the look on her face, wide-eyed horror mixed with sheer disbelief, was everything I had hoped for, a perfect portrait of a bully confronted by the very thing she thought she controlled, and though it lasted only seconds, the sound was so loud that it echoed down the cul-de-sac, bringing curtains twitching, doors creaking open, and neighbors peering out to see what in the world had just happened. And there was Karen, crouched on the pavement, clutching her dog, gasping for breath, her robe stained, her hair disheveled, looking nothing like the composed queen of the HOA she fancied herself to be, while my trash can stood tall, anchored firmly in place, unmoved by her petty attack, and I watched it all unfold on my phone screen, recording every glorious second, capturing her humiliation from a perfect angle, and I couldn't help but smile, not just because of the prank itself, but because I knew that the video I now possessed was dynamite, the kind of undeniable evidence that would unravel her carefully curated reputation brick by brick. But as I watched her scramble to her feet, eyes darting around to see who had witnessed her shame, I realized something even sweeter. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was afraid. Afraid of being caught, afraid of losing her grip on the neighborhood. And for the first time since this war began, I saw doubt in her, a crack in her armor, and I knew I had her. But Karen being Karen, she didn't back down immediately. No, she straightened her robe, scooped up her dog, and with a trembling attempt at composure, she actually marched up my driveway, pounding on my door as though I had committed some crime against her, shouting my name loud enough for the whole street to hear. And I let her rant out there for a minute, her voice shrill and desperate, before I finally opened the door, phone in hand. Video paused at the perfect frame of her recoiling from the blast. And when she saw me standing there calm, almost amused, her words faltered, her tirade collapsing into stammers about dangerous contraptions and violations of HOA policy. But I didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise my voice. I simply turned the phone toward her, pressed play, and let her watch herself in real time. Let her hear her own scream echo back at her. Let her see the look of terror on her own face. And the silence that followed was more satisfying than any insult I could have thrown, because for once, she had nothing. No comeback, no excuse, just the pale realization that she had been caught red-handed. And before she could recover, I leaned in and said quietly, "Next time you touch my property, this goes straight to the board and the neighborhood group chat." And her face drained of color as she spun on her heel and stormed off. Dog yapping furiously at her side, but the damage was already done because the neighbors who had peeked out had seen enough. The whispers began before she even reached her door, and that night, when I casually dropped the video into the community chat with the caption, "Strange wind we had this morning," the reaction was immediate and explosive. Messages pouring in from stunned residents, laughing emojis, disbelief. People who had long suspected Karen of similar behavior, but never had proof now rallying in agreement. And by the time the HOA meeting rolled around the following week, the board could no longer ignore it, because half the neighborhood was demanding answers, demanding accountability, and Karen, who usually sat front and center with her cookies and her smug smirk, slunk in late, avoided eye contact, and spent the entire meeting silent while the president awkwardly tried to calm the storm. And though no official action was taken against her, HOAs rarely bite their own, the social shift was unmistakable, because the spell had been broken, the queen dethroned, and suddenly she was the subject of jokes, the punchline of whispers, her authority hollow, her reign fractured. And I sat there in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching her squirm, savoring every second of the justice my trash can had delivered. But even as satisfying as it was, I knew Karen too well to think it was over, because people like her don't go quietly. They lick their wounds, they plot, and the glint of venom in her eyes as she finally dared to glance my way told me that she wasn't finished, not yet, and that if I thought the battle of the trash can was the end, I was dead wrong. It was only the beginning of a bigger, nastier war. I had thought the video, the humiliation, the whispers that spread like wildfire after the HOA meeting would be enough to silence Karen once and for all. But I should have known better, because people like her don't fade quietly into the background. They claw, they scratch, they scheme in the shadows. And sure enough, within days of her downfall, little signs began to appear that told me she was plotting a counterattack, though this time she wasn't relying on her old tactics of petty sabotage. No, this time she was going bigger, pulling strings with the HOA board, drafting letters on, official-looking letterhead that cited obscure compliance codes I'd never heard of, demanding inspections of my property, threatening fines for hazardous modifications. And it didn't take long to realize that she was targeting my fix itself, the reinforced trash can, the motion-triggered device, trying to paint it as some kind of dangerous weapon that violated neighborhood policy, and I had to admit, for a brief moment, I worried that she might actually succeed. Because if the board was gullible enough to buy her story, they could fine me thousands or even order me to remove the entire setup, effectively erasing the victory I'd worked so hard to claim. But what Karen didn't realize was that while she was busy plotting behind closed doors, I was already 10 steps ahead because I had anticipated she'd retaliate, and I had begun gathering evidence long before she even knew she'd been exposed, keeping backups of every video, every message, every suspicious notice that had mysteriously appeared in my mailbox. And when the official summons came from the HOA, an invitation to a compliance hearing in front of the board, I didn't panic. I prepared. I organized my file like a lawyer preparing for trial, documenting the weeks of her harassment, the sabotage, the mess she'd left on my car, the footage of her being blasted by the air horn, the countless petty notices she had orchestrated. And when the day of the hearing came, I walked into that stuffy little HOA conference room not as a defendant, but as a man holding the truth like a weapon. And as expected, Karen was already there, seated primly at the table with her arms crossed, her lips pursed, playing the victim, spinning her story about how my trash can was a threat to community safety, how it had endangered her and her pet, her voice dripping with false indignation, and for a moment I watched the board members nod, the president glancing at me with concern, clearly weighing whether I was in violation. And then when it was my turn, I simply reached into my folder, pulled out my phone, and played the full, unedited video. Karen sneaking across the street, Karen tipping the can, Karen blasted backward by the air horn, Karen's shriek echoing, Karen looking around in panic. And the room fell silent. The air sucked out like a vacuum, because in an instant the entire narrative flipped. She wasn't the victim. She was the aggressor, the saboteur, the bully who had been exposed. And though the board tried to keep their composure, I saw it in their eyes, the realization that they could no longer protect her without exposing their own bias. And after a tense pause, the president cleared his throat and declared that no violation had been found on my part, that my property was in compliance, and that any further disputes between myself and Mrs. well, let's just call her Karen, would be subject to mediation, which was their polite way of saying, "We're done cleaning up your messes," and the look on her face was priceless, a mix of rage and humiliation, her last weapon ripped from her hands in front of the very council she once commanded like her personal army, but still she didn't accept defeat gracefully. No, she stormed out of the meeting, her heels clacking like gunshots, her little dog barking in tow, muttering under her breath about lawsuits and safety codes. And for a moment I thought she might actually try to take it further, drag me into some drawn-out legal battle. But the truth is, the neighborhood had already turned on her. The tide had shifted permanently, and without their backing she had nothing, no power, no leverage, just the bitter taste of her own undoing. And in the weeks that followed, I watched as the once feared Karen became a ghost of her former self. Her waves across the street ignored, her cookies left untouched at block parties, her constant surveillance of lawns and mailboxes met with rolled eyes and cold shoulders, and the final nail in her coffin came one morning when, instead of my trash can, it was hers that had been knocked over, garbage strewn across her driveway, and though I had nothing to do with it, truly, I didn't, I couldn't help but notice how none of the neighbors rushed to help her pick it up. How they all just walked by, unconcerned, as if to silently say, "Now you know how it feels." And I realized then that I had won far more than a battle over a trash can. I had shifted the balance of the neighborhood itself, dethroned the petty tyrant, and reclaimed not just my peace of mind, but the dignity of everyone she had bullied before me. And as I wheeled my reinforced bin back to its place beside my garage that afternoon, the sun glinting off its solid frame, I smiled to myself, because it stood as more than just a container. For garbage now, it was a monument. A reminder that sometimes the smallest things, a trash can, a prank, a video, can topple the biggest egos. And though I knew Karen would never truly forgive or forget, I also knew she'd never again dare to touch my property. Because every time she looked at that can, she'd remember the blast, the humiliation, the whispers, the hearing, and the way her entire kingdom crumbled around her, and that, to me, was justice served.